a treasure trove of ancient records.
I think I have a right to access those records just like everybody else.
Accessible to some,
I know it's a historical building, but I don't think that's right.
but not all.
It's just plainly inconsistent with the ADA.
This week on Open Record, a free public museum
We need to do better.
with an unexpected barrier
That really felt like a slap in the face.
in the quest for reasonable accommodations. From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn. I'm here with Open Record's executive producer, Sarah Smith. Hey, Sarah.
Hi.
And we are once again joined by Contact 6's Jenna Sachs. Hi, Jenna.
Hi.
We're recording this episode on Wednesday, October 16th, 2024, but our topic takes us all the way back to 1904. Teddy Roosevelt was president. Construction had just begun on the Panama Canal. The World's Fair in St. Louis introduced the world to newly invented ice cream cones, and Racine, Wisconsin opened a brand new public library. Gives you a little bit of a time setting. 120 years later, that library is now a public museum, where ancient history is up against modern expectations of handicapped accessibility. We'll talk about that right after the break.
Welcome back to Open Record. You know, for many of us, elevators are a convenient way to avoid the stairs, but for millions of Americans, stairs might as well be mountains. This is the case for a Racine woman who wanted to do some research of historical records in her hometown. Bryan, what prompted her to reach out to you?
You know, it's interesting. The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't anything new. It's been around for a while. But I got an email from Minerva Siegel. A few years ago, she and her husband, Max, bought a house in Racine. It is also 120 years old. It was built in 1904. Beautiful house, by the way. The woodwork is incredible. They don't make them like they used to.
No, they don't.
She wanted to research the house because they were looking at doing some updates. She wanted to see maybe, are there historical photos? Maybe I could try to match the paint or whatever we do to what it was like when it was originally built. They didn't want to sort of mess with some of the historical nature of that property. And as it turns out, the Racine Heritage Museum has an archives room. They have all sorts of historical records from the city of Racine, county of Racine, that date back a long, long time, including individual property records. So she went online to see what are their how accessible is this old building, because she is in a wheelchair, or at least when she leaves the house, she uses an electric wheelchair. And she came across something on the website that indicated the building was not ADA accessible because this museum is 120 years old. But what stuck out to her was something it said right under that, which was, due to the historic nature of the building, we're exempt from ADA laws. And she thought, well, that doesn't sound right, because I thought it didn't matter how old the building was. You still had to make it as accessible as you could. And so she reached out to FOX6 to find out more.
So, the website says it's not ADA accessible. They are exempt. So, what was the step that she took then, to get to the museum? Or to get to the library, I'm sorry. Museum.
No, it wasn't. It was original library, but she instead of going there and knowing that it says on the website it's not handicapped accessible, she reached out to the director of the museum, or reached out to the museum. She said this was a couple of years ago, and she asked them about their accessibility. Could you build a ramp? Is there something you could do? And they said, look, this building's too old. It's too expensive. Our budget's too low. And she just felt like, well, that's not a place I'm going to be able to go. And I think this came up again more recently, which is what prompted her to call out or call us or email us now, is that she realized she has been dealing with more of her own issues when it comes to her disabilities. She's got a variety of things. She has arthritis. She has all sorts of a connective tissue disorder. She talked about all sorts of things, but more recently she had a stroke. So after this conversation a couple of years ago, she had a stroke, which has now made it virtually impossible for her to get up and down the stairs in her own home, which is a 4-level home. So they want to make some renovations to the house. And before they do that, she thought, I really need to look at some of the original records of the property. She wants to go and see them. So she inquired and sees that the museum says, we can do a search. We can have an archivist do the search for you. We have someone
available online, right? Like these aren't records, and
these are not records that they have this room. But before I get to what would happen next, if you go to the museum, you'll see that right out front, there are 8 steps to get up into the building. Well, that's already too much for someone in a wheelchair. There's no ramp. She can't go up steps. Then you go inside. Now you imagine someone who maybe they can ambulate a little bit. They can get up a few stairs. 8 steps isn't the worst step. Then you get inside and there's another flight up to the main level. And then when you're on the main level, I had actually gone in myself and I asked, is there a restroom I can use? Well, that's downstairs. And you go down another flight of stairs. And you get down there and you see the restrooms are down yet another flight of stairs. There are stairs everywhere you look. It is an old building. They didn't build them back then to accommodate people who had physical limitations. So this is not a place that anyone who really has trouble getting up and down is going to be able to go. So she asked about having research done for her. And the policy of the museum is that they charge $35 an hour to do the research for you. And they say that that is because they might have people who live states away who want to do really deep dives into research. And it's a service they provide. We'll do it, but we've got to pay someone to do that. So they have this archivist look up the records for them. In this case, she doesn't want to have someone do it for her. She just doesn't have a choice. She'd like to go in and look through the records herself and flip through the photos and flip through the documents. And it is by appointment only. So she would, if she could get in, could make an appointment. She could go in, she could look through the records, flip through the pages. And then if she wanted to print something out or make photocopies, then she'd have to pay. Like anybody else, you have to pay for the photocopies of those records. If she needed greater assistance than just looking on her own, there might be a charge at a certain point. But she's hearing it's going to cost me $35 an hour to do something that nobody else has to pay for.
Can do for free.
Right. And that's where I think she objected. So she decided, well, there's no point. I can't go. So she reached out to the FOX6 investigators and said she thinks there's a problem with that.
I thought it was interesting that she lives in a home that's also 120 years old, the same as the library. So she knows a bit about renovating a home to meet her needs so she can get in and out. You said something earlier about making this building as accessible as possible. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, so
museum?
And I've learned a lot just in this story about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We first talked about the law that goes back to 1990. It was signed under President Bush. It was the first time that on a federal level, it was determined that you cannot discriminate against someone due to a disability. And it was codified in federal code. And that covers a number of things. That means there's no discrimination in employment, in state and local government services, in telecommunications, and the one that applies here, public accommodations. So any place that's a business, a nonprofit, open to the public, you can't discriminate in terms of equal opportunity or access. You can't discriminate against someone who has disabilities. So in this case, you look at an old existing facility that's not physically accessible, technically they are required to come up with a way to build ramps or do something to make it physically accessible. But there's a point at which you go, okay, this is an historic building. You could actually disrupt the historic nature of the building, number one. Number two, it would be incredibly expensive. The Racine Heritage Museum is a free museum. They operate on a pretty small budget. I think it's a few $100,000 a year. So they look at this and they go, we can't afford to build a new building. We'd love to. We'd love to have a new shiny facility with elevators and ramps and easy access. We can't afford that. And there's no way we could renovate this building. So that phrase you point out, as accessible as possible, they have to make it as accessible as they can within reason. But if it creates an undue financial hardship to do that, there is an exemption for that. But that doesn't mean you don't have to do anything. You still have to do, so for instance, there are alternatives to completely renovating your building. It might be that you have a service that you go, well, people have to come into this room to do this thing, but maybe we have an alternative room on the first floor that's accessible that people get to. Unfortunately, at this museum, there is no such thing. As soon as you go in, you're up 8 steps, then you're up some more steps, or you're down. There's nowhere that is accessible. So you could have a separate area that's accessible that you could use for the service. One of the other alternatives, though, here would be, well, since you can't get into the research, we'll do the research for you at no charge. By charging $35 an hour to someone with a disability because they can't get in for something someone else could do for free, that is no longer as accessible as possible. And I think that's probably what the law says. Again, I'm not a lawyer. These are the things I'm learning as I've dug into this.
What did the Wisconsin Historical Society have to say?
Well, it's one of the things that stood out to me is what I started when I first got this email. I thought I've got to dive in and learn. I don't know much about what applies here. Are historical buildings, in fact, exempt? Is there some sort of grandfather clause that says if you were built before a certain year, you don't have to be accessible? And as it turns out, that's not the case. In fact, when I Googled historical buildings ADA exemption, the first thing that came up was the Wisconsin Historical Society has a post on their website that says historical buildings are not exempt. You still have to make them as accessible as possible. And then they have resources for how, if you have an existing building that predates the law that is not accessible, some options you have or contractors you can work with and how you can sort of determine whether or not what is doable, whether or not it's doable, or if there are alternatives. But just being in an old building doesn't mean you're suddenly exempt. Like, well, we've been here before the law, so we don't have to do anything. What I'm being told is that's not how it works.
Is Minerva one of the first ones to maybe go to the museum with this, or have?
It sounds like no. She might be the first one to really raise this issue to the degree she has, because she told me she has spoken to other people since who have been maybe veterans, elderly veterans who've gone to look at records. Well, they get in the building and think, like I said earlier, all right, I can make it up that first flight of stairs. And then they get in and they say, where's the restroom? Well, it's down there. Actually, you've got to go down 2 flights to get to it. And they go, well, now I've just got to go somewhere. So she's heard stories of others who have, she says, had problems at this facility, but maybe none who raised quite the stink that she has. And Minerva is someone who is not afraid to put herself out there. I mean, she's an interesting character. We didn't really get too deep into this in the story. There's a little mention of this, but Minerva is, you can see sort of right off the bat, you see she's got kind of the nose rings and green hair. She's a little bit of a free spirit. And in fact, she's made some money. She used to be a dog trainer, and because of her physical limitations, had to stop her dog training business and instead started writing and blogging. And one of her areas of interest is Wiccans and witchcraft and tarot cards and things like that, and the ancient practice of tarot. Well, she ended up getting interest from a lot of places. Say, hey, could you make tarot cards for us? She has published a couple of books. She ended up making sets of tarot cards, decks of tarot cards for Disney, for Tim Burton, Nightmare Before Christmas.
Sure.
So licensed cards. She said she's got one right now that's either coming out or in the works with Christina Ricci, who's known for a lot of that kind of acting. So she's had some success in that realm. And I think she actually looks at this and says, $35 an hour. Could I afford to pay it? Maybe. But it's the principle, because there are others who can't. And many people with disabilities, she says, don't have jobs and don't have income where they could afford this kind of thing.
So Minerva took this step, I understand, of posting something online about her experience. Is that right?
She did. And that's actually what really prompted her to reach out to us. Wasn't just the situation existing. It's how the museum responded. We're going to take a break, and we'll talk about that when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. So Minerva goes public with her concerns by posting a 1-star review. We've all seen those, right? Sometimes you get frustrated enough to put an online review. She posts a 1-star review of the Racine Heritage Museum, and she explains this concern about the $35 an hour charge for research. She says that's 5 times the minimum wage, and a lot of people with disabilities just can't afford that. Well, the museum responds to her publicly, and what they say is, our research charges go towards supporting the museum. It's a free museum. It's a mission that we serve the public, but we just can't afford a new building. And we would love to have a new building. It's something that's in our future plans, but we really need help getting that done. And they they did offer, I should point out, they offered a 15-minute free, what they called quick search.
Has she heard that before?
I believe it was posted on the website. They said they could do this free quick search, but after 15 minutes, it would then be $35 per hour. And she felt that that was still a problem on principle for her, because it's not a limitation that's placed on anyone else. I or you could make an appointment to go in and spend all day looking at the records at no charge. She's being told, well, we can do a quick 15-minute search, but you're still going to be charged after that. What bothered her most, though, was the last line of that response, which said, if you'd care to donate to a new facility, here's a link and here's how you can do that. And I think the reason, when I discussed this, the reason that upset Minerva so much was she felt as essentially they were saying, if you want access to these records, pay for a new building yourself.
Had she ever contacted the museum to say, hey, I'd like to see these records. Your building's inaccessible. I see there's this 15-minute, free search. Can you bend the rules for me?
There had been a back and forth of emails. I've not seen all of those emails, but it sounds like there had been quite a bit of discussion. I did go into the museum and ask them about this when I was there. They wouldn't talk on camera, but the museum's director and assistant director essentially confirmed the things she had said, which was that they could do this for 15 minutes, and after that, they would have to charge. They did say, though, that she never asked to do the 15-minute search. And they said they did eventually send me a statement that said if she had asked for that, it may well have been that they could have accomplished it for free in 15 minutes. But I get the sense from Minerva, this wasn't so much about whether or not she could afford to pay or whether they could get the search done. She was really calling out the principle of the differences in policy, that you can only do 15 minutes for free for someone who's disabled, but someone who can get in there, who can get up and down the steps, can spend all day. And she felt that that was discriminatory, and I think she wanted to call attention to it, which is why she put out the post. But I do want to be clear, she never did ask them to run the search. It may well be that in 15 minutes they'd say, here's all the records you need. What would you like copies of? I think she'd still run into one other question, though. Photocopies cost money.
Mm-hmm.
That if I went and looked, I might look at the pictures and say, or the documents say, actually, I'm not interested.
Not
in
important
these.
to me, yeah.
But the only way they can get them to her is to photocopy them, I would think. So
Well,
I'm still not clear on what happens if they find all the records
Yeah.
and they say, we have this and this. Would you like them? We're going to now have to charge you. She still doesn't have a way to review them that I'm aware of without being charged. And I think that's in one of the emails she received from the museum. They said the free 15-minute search would require a photo. If we find photos that would, I think they said there are up to 3 photos that you can get, and that would be a $10 charge. So to her, she said, that's not free. That's $10. And if I wanted to go and look myself as an able-bodied person, I could do that without charge. So there's some real questions about what all the details were of those discussions back and forth. But in the end, I think she was really concerned on principle that there's a difference here.
So obviously you spoke with an attorney also. So,
Yeah.
when it comes to this, all this back and forth. So, obviously with the laws and everything, they're not required to go bankrupt with the renovations. But, did the attorney have like here's what could make things a little bit better?
Well, as I said at the beginning of this, whenever we do these stories, you know this, Jenna, we don't start out as experts on these issues.
Right.
I'm not an Americans with Disabilities Act legal expert. That's why we reach out to experts. So I contacted Disability Rights Wisconsin because initially when Minerva reached out, I didn't know if there was a story here. It may well be that this museum is old and exempt and there's nothing they can do. So I reached out to Disability Rights Wisconsin, and an attorney named Hannah Balder contacted me. We're going to hear from her live here on Open Record in just a little bit. But Hannah responded and said that, in fact, that does sound like a violation of the ADA. Not because they have steps and no ramps. She went back to that question of, is it reasonable to expect them to completely renovate the museum? She says no one's asking them to renovate the museum and spend millions of dollars. But there are alternatives, and one of those she suggested would be if they're charging $35 an hour to everyone, then it's perfectly fine to charge $35 an hour to someone with a disability. But if you can access those records for free because you can get up and down stairs, then they have to find a way to make free access possible for someone with a disability. She said the term she used was, it is plainly inconsistent with the ADA to have these dual standards. So again, she's not saying they have to build ramps and elevators or build a new building.
Right.
She's just saying they have to find some alternative way to make those records accessible.
What about Racine County, right? I assume they're getting funding from the county for this museum?
That's actually an interesting point here, because when I first talked to Hannah Balder, she made the assumption that this was a government building, and there is a whole section of ADA that is covered by, it's called Title II, that applies to state and local government services. But there's a different section of the ADA that applies to public accommodations. That is private businesses run by nonprofits or private companies that are open to the public, restaurants and bars and museums and other things, sports arenas, whatnot. And in this case, it would be Title III that applies. But the building is owned by Racine County. So the inaccessible building is owned by a government entity, and the nonprofit leases space and runs the museum. So there's maybe some dual responsibility here. So I did reach out to Racine County and talk to the supervisor who represents the district where both Minerva's home is and also where the museum is. That is District 1. I believe it's District 1 in Racine County. And she's a freshman supervisor. Her name is Valina Coleman. She was immediately very upset about this and concerned and said, I'm going to make phone calls and I'm going to find out if we have some responsibility here, because as the county, we're leasing them the space. And if they're not making their services available to all, then we have some concerns here. I didn't hear back from Valina Coleman after that. I heard back from Racine County's Corporation Counsel. That's their lawyer. And the Corporation Counsel said in a statement, effectively, we've spoken to the museum about this and sort of underscored the importance of accessibility, and you'll be hearing from them as well. And then I got a contact from the museum, and the director of the museum, Christopher Polcyn, essentially said that we offered this 15-minute search and she never took us up on it. We might have been able to accomplish it in that, but he added, if it takes more than 15 minutes, we would be, of course, happy to accommodate that free of charge. That's the first time anyone said that if it went beyond 15 minutes, they would do it free of charge. I did follow up and ask the director, is that just an exception you're making for Minerva, or is that a policy that applies to anyone who can't get into your facility? And he said it would apply. He said our practice, he used the term practice, our practice applies to anyone with a disability. So from what I'm hearing from the museum, they are now saying that if you can't get into the archives room and you want to look at those records, they will work with you to do a search free of charge. Still have a question about what happens if you want to see those records once they find them. Again, photocopies cost money, but that's where it got to at this point. I think for me, what really stood out most about this story was it almost seemed as though this is an issue that's been going on and no one's really challenged them. And I don't know if the museum really understood what their responsibilities were under the law, because one of the things they said to me off camera was they used the term grandfather. They were grandfathered in. They've been there since the 1960s. The ADA wasn't passed until the 1990s. And so they felt they were exempt from that law. It turns out that's not the case.
Understand. I'm looking forward to hearing from this lawyer.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much I learned, and I really enjoyed talking to Hannah Balder. She's an attorney for Disability Rights Wisconsin. She is going to join us here on Open Record when we come right back. We are back on Open Record. We have a special guest who is joining us via Zoom. It is Hannah Balder, staff attorney for Disability Rights Wisconsin. Hannah, thank you for taking your time out to join us here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you didn't get to listen in because I know you were doing other things, but I've been spending 20 minutes trying to pretend I know something about ADA law, and I'm not the expert here. That's you. That's why you're here. This particular issue I brought to your attention when I first reached out, and I was telling Jenna and telling Sarah this, I didn't know if there was a problem here. The museum's original comment to me off camera was, we've been here since the 1960s. The law was passed in 1990. We're grandfathered. And so my first question to you was just to find out, is that true? Is there such a thing as a grandfather clause for old historic buildings?
Well, this is a pretty common misconception that there's this grandfather clause. It doesn't exist. There are, for older buildings, some of the accessibility issues are pretty standard, and they can, if there are physical accessibility issues, they can remain until they do construction, and then they have to make their construction accessible. But what happened in this case was not about physical accessibility at all. It was about providing reasonable accommodations. And in this case, the accommodation that they offered, they decided the person would have to pay for it. And that was the real problem here.
Tell me a little bit, when you say this is an issue of reasonable accommodations, what does reasonable accommodations really mean under the ADA?
So a public place like the Racine Heritage Museum has to offer accommodations to people with disabilities. So in this case, if a person can't physically get into the building, offering to deliver, find, scrounge up the records that person wanted and give them to them is a great example of a reasonable accommodation. No one is asking the museum here to, rip up their building and build something new so that this person can access, the records themselves. Giving the records to a person and delivering them in a way that's accessible to that person is a great, reasonable accommodation. The problem is that the museum tried to charge this person for the accommodation, which is totally unnecessary. There's no reason that the Racine Museum can't afford to have a volunteer up there for an hour trying to find these records. There's just no reason to be charging this person for this reasonable accommodation.
It's interesting. I wonder if other people are encountering this. Other people with disabilities. Is this a pretty common hurdle to run into, this lack of access and issues with equal access?
Oh, absolutely. We get calls all the time about, I guess the classic is like a door doesn't work. A door is supposed to be accessible and the button doesn't work and no one will fix it. I think that for me, I was a little shocked that the accommodation would be charged to the person. I think that's pretty unusual. That's not something I hear very often.
In my back and forth with the director of the museum, I spoke in person to the director and assistant director, and then I got an email, had an email exchange back and forth. They did say in their online post that they have this 15-minute free quick search, and they are telling me by email now that if Minerva Siegel had simply taken them up on that, she might well have gotten all the records that she wanted for free and not exceeded the 15 minutes, but that she never actually requested that. Does that matter here if after 15 minutes it's going to cost $35, but there's a 15-minute free option?
So there's this idea with accommodations that if something is unreasonable, so it's either a big financial burden or an administrative burden to the museum, they don't have to offer that accommodation. And they, if they were going to charge other people $35 an hour, it's fine for them to charge this person. The problem is that we cut off that conversation long before we even got to a discussion about if it was reasonable. This person was told that they would have to be charged for it. And if those first 15 minutes are free to anyone else, why are we even talking about charging this person? They just really jumped the gun in terms of, what we can do and what we can't do and what it'll cost you when we do it.
So ADA, can we just talk about that for a second and take that step back? So it's been around for decades now. Can we just talk about what ADA is and why it's necessary in everyday life now?
Sure. The ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a piece of legislation that offers equal enjoyment to people with disabilities. So one of the most common places that you hear about it is in the context of employment. Getting an accommodation at work is an example of something that would fall under Title I of the ADA. Title II and Title III you hear about maybe less frequently. Title II offers equal enjoyment to people who are engaging in government services. So if you are applying to work with the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in the state of Wisconsin, those services have to be accessible to you, both physically and in another sense. They have to offer accommodations for non-physical accessibility issues. And then Title III covers places of public accommodation. So grocery stores, movie theaters, things like that. The person who's putting themselves out as a business has to make accommodations for people. That's the deal when you put yourself out as a business. You have to agree to include people with disabilities. And then there are some other titles of the ADA that we just don't talk about very often, or you don't hear about very often. But again, it's just mostly about employment and just sort of anywhere you go on a day-to-day basis.
So for buildings, though, that, were built before this became a law, what are the expectations and requirements now if they're not ADA compliant?
So again, nobody's asking these older buildings to tear themselves up and do this really expensive construction to make things beautifully accessible. I think that's pretty generally considered to be unreasonable. But when new buildings are built or when older buildings do construction, that's when they have to really focus on making things accessible. So if an older building decides, you know what, we're going to redo our bathrooms, that's all we have money for, our bathrooms are old, we got to fix them. Those bathrooms have to be ADA accessible. There has to be a door that opens automatically or with a push of a button. There has to be a stall big enough to fit a person who uses a wheelchair. But the idea that you don't have to worry about the ADA if you're an older building or an older facility is just way off base.
Jenna asked a really good question earlier before you were on, and that was the Wisconsin Historical Society it's one of the first places I went on its website. It says that, in fact, the Racine Heritage Museum's view of this from the beginning was wrong, which is that historic buildings are not exempt from the ADA. But they use a phrase that you have to make your services or your buildings as accessible as possible. And Jenna asked, well, what does that really mean? And you're talking about these reasonable accommodations. It seems to me there's a lot of room for interpretation about what's a reasonable accommodation. Does that become a case-by-case basis? How do you determine what's reasonable when you're dealing with, in this case, a free museum that's a very small budget, but someone who says there's records there everybody else can get to and I want to get to them?
I think when it comes to reasonable accommodations, people work way too hard to try to find a reason why things won't work. It's absolutely a case-by-case situation to figure out what's reasonable, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's really easy. I mean, this was a case where I think it was really easy. It's not reasonable to have the museum use their budget to build an access ramp for this one person to access these records. It is reasonable to have somebody else get those records for them. So again, like, there's room for interpretation. It's case by case, but I think in most cases, it's really not that complicated.
What? Go ahead, Jen.
No, I was interested in some of the bigger trends you're seeing in disability rights right now, because obviously this is a very specific issue. But are you hearing about other issues affecting people in terms of access?
Absolutely. How much time do we have? Some of the, I mainly focus on employment law, so I can speak a lot to what's going on there. The current things that I'm really seeing trending are people asking for accommodations, and instead of engaging in a conversation with that person about what they need, the person is put on unpaid leave until there's this discussion about if it's reasonable. That's pretty blatantly inconsistent with the ADA. In terms of physical accessibility, people who run businesses, people who employ people with disabilities, think of disability, in my experience, in this very, very narrow sense. You think of a person with a wheelchair. If they have a disability, it's something that I can see, but that's not the case at all. The CDC tells us that 1 in 4 people have a disability. So there are people with disabilities all around you who are having trouble accessing your services, even if you don't know it. So there's really this responsibility that everyone has, even if, even if you can't see it, even if you don't think you employ people with disabilities, even if you don't think a person in a wheelchair wants to come to your haunted house, I promise they do.
Well, I think it's really interesting you say that, because I also can imagine from the business community side of things, that's where a lot of the pushback comes from, because this is a cost. You're saying you've got a service, or you've got an operation that does just fine for people who have no disabilities, but then you bring in the need for accommodations. That comes with cost. Is that really where the big pushback is? Well, yeah, but to accommodate this is going to cost me a lot of money.
I think, that's a conversation that does happen. But before we get to that, I think first I see a lot of, it's not fair. That's a reason to turn down accommodations quite frequently. If I let this person do this, it's not fair to other people. Or just people in particular, I think employers don't want to try because they're scared that they get it wrong, that they're going to get in more trouble. So they don't try to offer accommodations. They don't try to put themselves out as a place that should offer accommodations. So while we may get to that conversation down the line about cost, in my experience, that's not really where the trouble starts.
Is there one entity that maybe is a little bit more reluctant to make the ADA changes, like say a privately owned business versus a government owned or private entity?
That's a great question. I think some of the smaller companies, in my experience, are better. Some of the smaller shops are better just because you can have a conversation with them and explain to them what you need and why you need it. And so much of this work, in my experience, is about just a misunderstanding of disability and a need to help people get it. And I think I've had experiences where I've talked to smaller business owners, I've talked to smaller employers, and you have the opportunity to have that conversation with them and help them get it. When you look at bigger organizations, then that's where some of that fear creeps in. Like, I can't talk to you, you're a lawyer. Now you have to talk to my lawyer, and it just spirals out of control. And it gets harder and harder to have conversations with larger agencies and larger business owners about how to best serve people with disabilities, just because it's just harder to get them on the phone. It's harder to, I think the fear is a lot more significant.
Hannah, this is obviously the Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights piece of legislation. And on the one hand, I don't know how much of a civil right we're going to fight over if you got a right to go have a burrito somewhere, although you do have it. But there are certain things that are greater civil rights or more important than others, and voting is maybe one of the greatest. What are you seeing right now with a major election looming in terms of issues that are facing people in Wisconsin with disabilities when it comes to voting access?
Gosh, we have a whole team here that works just on voting issues. So they would be a great guest. But in the meantime, I could tell you lots of issues with just accessible voting equipment. I know the U.S. Department of Justice has chosen to pursue legal action against a town that decided that they don't need accessible equipment. That's something that happens quite frequently, that there's just not accessible equipment, or if it's there, it doesn't work. But as an agency, we always tell people, even if you don't think you need it, it's great to go out and use accessible equipment on voting day. You don't have to have a disability. You don't have to prove that you need it. But we encourage everyone to use accessible equipment just to remind folks that it's there and it's for everyone, and there's a need for everyone to access it.
Has the increase in early voting, mail-in voting, drop boxes, things like that, has that helped people with disabilities in terms of access to voting or ease of voting?
Oh, it's been a huge help. The DRW has been involved in quite a bit of litigation about this, and fast-moving litigation given how quickly the election is coming up. But there's been a real push from disability rights to encourage legislation to allow people to vote electronically or by mail-in ballot, because the reality is that there are people with disabilities, whether for physical reasons or other disabilities, who just cannot leave the house but still deserve to be engaged and still have a right to participate in elections.
Well, Hannah Balder, we're so grateful for your time here on Open Record. These are issues we probably could talk for hours about some of these things, but your expertise is valuable, and so is your time. So thank you for spending it with us here on Open Record.
Thank you. I appreciate your time as well.
All right, we will go off the record when we come right back. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by answering a question for which we have done no preparation. And here to ask that question is executive producer Sarah. Oh, wait. Before you ask,
Before we get anywhere, I want to say hello to my fans.
Oh,
That's not what you were going.
I had it before we go. But
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I got recognized over the weekend for being on Open Record. So hello to my fan. One. If my mom and my mother-in-law don't count. But
My favorite part is that she didn't say, "Hey, I know you from Open Record." She
No.
said, "Wait, why don't I? Are you on Open Record?" Yeah.
yes, I am. And then so now I have an agent. So just don't talk. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But that's exciting. Okay. So
Maybe I'll cancel.
People are watching.
it's good. I mean, doesn't matter how, but here we are.
Now I'm gonna have to cancel this part of the podcast. Never. No. So this is what I wanted before you get to the question. So Sarah is a co-host of Open Record, but she is also our executive producer. That makes her our boss, right?
Yes.
You're my boss.
Yes.
And today, October 16th,
Oh my gosh.
is Boss's Day. So
Oh no. Am I going to cry? First. Oh, okay.
Don't get
say something coming from me.
Brian hates pickles.
I hate pickles.
You
like
These
pickles.
are the best pickles.
Milwaukee
Never had sloppy pickles.
And plus, is really extending myself here.
Oh my gosh. I think I'd candy. Oh my gosh, a bag of candy corn.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not going to eat these together.
Well, I asked you if you like candy corn by itself or if it needs to be in like a mix.
No, just straight up.
Straight up. And
Straight up. I like it right now.
If you have it with pickles, I'll leave right now.
Gosh, Brian.
Anyway,
this
so
is
happy Boss
wonderful.
Day.
Thanks. Oh, I really thought you were going to talk about my fans, but I mean, they're both equally good.
That's right.
Okay.
Anyhow, so what do we have?
Wow, he's leaving a lot of time for off the record today.
Yeah.
Maybe you knew my question was going to be.
My annual review needs to be at least
Yeah.
4.
Use these and isn't until June. Okay, so today's questions, there's like 2 of them if we don't get through, or if we get through one quickly. It's about cell phones. So I had screenshotted a picture or something to my mom. This was a couple weeks ago. And my battery was at 62%.
Mm-hmm.
She texted me back, nothing about the screenshotted picture that I had sent her, but instead she said, plug in your phone. I was like, plug in my phone? 62%.
60.
So at what percentage are you kind of in panic mode, like, oh, I better plug in my phone?
Not until there's usually a red bar.
Yeah.
Do you let the plug in every night?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I don't. Partly because when you turn off the light switches in my bedroom, all the outlets don't work. Is that how it's in your house?
No.
Only on the top ones, but the bottom.
Oh, it's one has the clock. Well, anyway,
Okay.
I used to charge it.
Your plug.
No,
Yeah.
wait until it's at red.
Okay.
I don't work until 10%.
I don't. Yeah, I can get it. No, I don't.
No.
I don't go till red. 62 seems a little crazy to me. But
I plug mine in every night. But I think I don't know if I'm just bad to my battery or whatever it is, but I wait until it's like under 5%.
Oh, you know?
I mean, no, that's not true. I mean, if it's at 62% and I'm near a charger, I'll charge it.
Fine.
Right.
But I'm saying I frequently get to where I'm at 5% or less, and
I feel way more comfortable if I'm like, 5%, and I'll just keep dinking on it or whatever. But if I'm like out and about and it's 5%, I'm in basically panic.
Well, I have one of those things in your car where you attach it and it charges. You know, like I can put it on my vent or something, and it just sits there and charges. So I'm constantly charging my phone whenever I'm going somewhere.
I think
I'm not worried as much about that.
Actually, if you're charging in the car, does it charge up or just barely keep up? Because if I'm on GPS and things, it stays about the same.
Well, if you're using it, like the math of it, yeah. Dale, when do you charge your phone?
Just at night.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I never charge it during the day. No. This brings up a whole nother thing about whether you should charge your phone like all the time kind of thing.
No.
You're supposed to get down and it's just
let it down.
It's too confusing. I just say.
So Steve Noviello, who does the FOX6 or whatever it is, in my 2 cents or whatever it is, and he always has it comes out all the time, and he's talking about how you charge your phone at you charge your phone at 50%, but never charge it more than 90%, and every so often you take it down to all the way, and you know about that. That's too much planning. I can't do that.
The thing is, I know I did a story about this like a year and a half ago, and I can't remember which battery. It's because certain battery types benefit from charging it before it reaches that halfway mark, and some do better if you let it dwindle.
You know what my answer to that is? Every so often get a new phone, and then the battery's in great shape.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
Then I'd pour. There was an issue I had with my phone. This was a couple months ago where I was trying to get it out of the way. I was sitting on the ground on the floor in my house, and I slid it, and it slid, and one of the buttons got slammed, like it got pushed in so hard that it kept like glitching. And I took it to the store, and they were looking at it. They're like, I don't know. So then finally they were like, well, just let the battery die and then plug it in, and it should reset. And I'll be darned, it worked. So that was the first time I think
power off, power on.
Yeah, the power off. Right. There was something about letting the phone get all the way to 0 and die, and then plug it back in. That all of a sudden it's.
I'm still stuck on the fact that, and this is a thing that when you send people a screenshot, and they look for the stuff on the periphery to comment on, like we're going to charge your phone, or I'll post something like a photo. And people don't pay attention to the focus of the photo. They're like, I see the Doritos in the background. How you angle it's like, why are you always looking at stuff?
Well, I'm kind of guilty.
The thing is, I take a photo and you look at your phone and it's on a small screen.
Yes. Oh, and
but then someone looks at that photo on a giant screen and they see little things in the background. I'm like, hey, have you done the laundry lately? It looks like you got a pile over there.
Oh, while you're watching the Vikings.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, that's a good question. I don't know.
I thought your question was going to be, what's the last thing you screenshot on your phone? That's where I thought you were going, and I was racking my brain thinking, what was the last thing I took a screenshot of? I think I was searching, that's so dull. I was searching for healthy bread because I recently realized the bread I'm buying is ultra processed. And because I do these consumer reports for the station, and I'm constantly saying, I need to throw out all my pans, and I need to get a wash because of the pesticides. Like, I'm always learning something new about them.
Do you want to know what I screenshot most? And this is just, it's everything about just aging.
Yeah.
I screenshot things with small print so that I can zoom in on them and read them. Labels and other things. I constantly am going around screenshot. Yeah, it's all the time.
Wow.
If you said that,
well, I said the girl screenshot bread. So.
Okay, but if there's like a small label on something, instead of doing one of these, I just take a screenshot and it's easy.
Can't you just zoom in anyway on your phone?
Well,
without screenshotting?
No, but then it's moving around because you're doing. So I prefer to just get the static screenshot and zoom in.
The last thing I screenshotted was this article that was Jesse Winker says he'll hate the city of Milwaukee for forever.
No.
At the end of every month, I go through my photos because I want to clean off the phone, and so it's not whatever. And I'll put them on a hard drive, whatever I want to save. And that's where that's when I see what all the screenshots are.
Oh,
you ever look at those and go, "What was I doing?"
Yeah, mine will pop up on our Alexa, like, or whatever the video one or the picture one is, and I'm like, because it automatically uploads it to there, and also, what is that? I was like, oh, it's just a picture of somebody's screenshot.
Or I go through and I'm like, why is there a crumpled up sock? And then I'm like, oh, because I sent out something to the family. Does anyone know whose sock this is? All right, we're going to take one more break and we'll wrap things up when we come back. We are just about out of time, but Sarah's going to dig us to the corn. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on Open Record, an issue you think we should investigate for Fox 6 News, or if, like me, you don't like candy corn, let us know at FOX6 Investigators at Fox.com. As always, thank you to the people who make this podcast possible, including our executive producer, Happy Bosses Day, Sarah Smith.
Cheers.
Our editor, Dave Machuda, who is also running the video switcher. And of course, Jenna Sachs. Thank you for being here today.
No problem.
With that, I'm Bryan Polcyn. We'll be back next week.